It says we're live.
So
Yeah,
we start the show then.
yeah, you can go whenever.
Start the show, John.
Okay, everybody out there watching the show right now, we're having technical difficulties. The streaming service that we usually use to do the show has gone down for reasons we don't know what's going on here, but we are able to come to you anyway. The video's probably going to be okay. The audio maybe not as good, but maybe good enough. So we're going to go ahead with the show anyway. And of course, we got Gary Vasilash here, the famous Gary Vasilash. We've got Dave Andrea from Plante Moran.
The more famous.
The more famous, soon to leave Plante Moran, but we'll get into that. We got Lindsay Brooke, our
Infamous.
colleague, the infamous Lindsay Brooke. But we're going to do Autoline After Hours anyway. And I know, Gary, one of the things that you wanted to have us talk about is how much the four of us have seen the auto industry change over the course of our careers.
And I think particularly since Dave will be retiring from Plante Moran at the end of the month, and he has probably had more perspectives on different things than the three of us all working as journalists through our careers have had. I think, Dave, we need to start with you to give us just give us a snapshot of where we are now and how we got there.
Well, look, over the 40 years, I have had many different perspectives. They've always been from the outside looking in to the industry here. But sometimes, Gary, I think it's the more things change, the more they stay the same. Going through, like on the Working Relations Index studies, I remember.
And let me interject here, the Working Relation Index, this is where suppliers evaluate how the different automakers treat them, I guess is the way to put it. But just for those who may not know the WRI off the top of their heads.
Perfect, John. Yeah. I can go back truly to 1983, 1984, when I was an intern at Ford Motor Company. And some of the comments that are in the WRI are things that I experienced 40 years ago. So it hasn't changed that much. Without a doubt, though, what has changed is the globalization of the industry in terms of the number of players and the culture of the players. And certainly Detroit has changed from when I started 40 years ago.
So you're basically always looking at it from the point of view of relationships between the two types of organizations, the OEMs, as well as the mainly tier one suppliers, and then also sort of from an economic perspective. Is that fair to say?
Well, the economics come in terms of the macro environment. And we do see over the years how things change. If you go back 15 years or so, when the industry was all coming back, the production levels were all growing, profits were in the industry, the numbers follow the profitability. A lot of times when things get difficult, that's when the relationships tighten up in terms of everybody's trying to get protect and get their own dollar. And that's where we see a lot of the tension and stress in the industry.
You know, when I got into the industry, boy, it was a different world, completely different world. It was the World War II generation was running the auto industry. And I don't mean the World War II generation that ran World War II. I'm talking about the grunts. So like, you know, when I got onto Automotive Industries magazine, one of our guys that I worked with had been at the D-Day invasion. He was a captain in an LST. Had another guy that worked on the magazine that had fought through North Africa and up through the Italian campaign. Had another guy that was on a minesweeper in the Pacific. And so the whole attitude at that time was America was so great. Detroit was so important. And I remember wanting to write about these companies called Toyota and Honda and Datsun at the time, and getting criticized. Why are you writing about those companies? Those are the Japanese. We beat them in the war. And, when I think back to the attitude then and the way that the industry was structured, it's completely different today. I mean, back then, the Detroit Three, the big three as they were known then, right now they're the big 4, 5, and 6. That's how much they've come down. Is they built something like 80% of everything in-house. And the supplier industry was this small little thing that they were tires and maybe they were some specialty transmissions and stuff like that. But the car companies did everything in-house. They had there was not the supplier industry that there is today. It's completely changed now. They buy 70 to 80% of what goes into a car.
And the engineering and design work flipped around as well. And that's part of that globalization. And you probably get the same type of opinion right now about writing about BYD and Geely and some of those other Chinese firms. But the thing with the half-lives, right? Because it took Volkswagen decades, right, to make their inroads. Then it took, when you look at Hyundai and Daewoo and the like, it just took decades for them to grow. And so the speed of how the industry has changed from a market share standpoint and then from a leverage standpoint has, without a doubt, has changed dramatically. And that's where, going back to the 25 years ago with the WRI, the leverage was purely in the hands of the vehicle manufacturers.
So mainly the vehicle manufacturers could tell the suppliers, we want this, this is what we want, when we want it, and what you're going to pay us.
Well, right. And so when you said, well, why do you put up, when you ask the question, well, why do you put up with that attitude? Well, it's the volume, right? And that's the customer, and we'll do anything for the customer. Where things have changed now, because you have to go down 5, 6, 7, and 8, right, to get in terms of total production share. Now that leverage has changed. And that's where we see the vehicle manufacturers then respond to the survey, because the suppliers have choices. And in fact, when we give them the comments, there's direct comments. We're working away from one OEM, or we want to grow with another OEM. And with the technology transformation that it's moving so fast, the vehicle manufacturers have to try, at least, to be a customer of choice, that the suppliers want to work with them.
So going back.
Sorry, 1 second, Gary. We don't have many complaints or anything like that in the comments. We have about 100 people watching now on this one. Do you mind just giving a quick little update on kind of what's going on?
Yeah. Sean just asked me to talk to you guys who are watching right now. We're having technical difficulties. The streaming service that we use normally to go live with the show, which we've been using now since 2008, never had a problem. Somehow or other, it went down today. We're still trying to figure out what's going on with that. So we've got sort of a backup mode. The audio may not be as good. I think the video's okay, but just so all of you watching understand right now why it's not to our regular production quality standards. You know what's going on.
Thank you. I think that should be good.
But
Sorry,
the content is above first rate. I just want to make that clear. So
We're going to make it that way.
So John was talking about how early on in our careers, OEMs were vertically integrated. Why did they stop being vertically integrated?
Well, there was always a perception that they were the high cost manufacturer. So I go back when I was an analyst at Roney and Company, and that was at the time when GM was spinning off what became the Delphi assets. Ford was spinning off the Visteon assets. I remember going to these meetings where the vehicle manufacturer side would make this case that they had to spin off the parts side of their business because it was too capital intensive, it was too costly, and they were going to shed that and become more profitable. And then literally you would go next door to hear the Delphi or the Visteon or the AccuStar story. They never went in public, but and it was completely the opposite. Well, wait, because we're going to be focused, we're going to be capital efficient, we're going to be profitable, we're going to be able to sell, of course, more so to other OEMs, and we're going to diversify our customer base. And you're like, well, wait a minute. Just 5 minutes ago, you heard that these were the worst assets, the most costly, and now it's the best story ever. So it didn't jive. It didn't.
But during that period too, we had in this history, the Japanese setting up manufacturing widespread particularly in the eastern part of the US. And Toyota and Honda brought their Keiretsus with them. And for a long time, you'd hear about, well, we can't compete because of the Keiretsu. We can't compete because of the relationship with Aisin and Denso and et cetera, et cetera. And that was seen as a real asset that the new Japanese North American automakers had.
Mm-hmm. Well, there, Lindsay, the thing I always found funny was when I was at Ford and we had the internal parts division side, we treated those guys as worse or more worse than
You treated them like dirt.
as an independent supplier.
Yeah.
And you'd question that. Why would you, it's the same, it's a Ford paycheck, right? And they did because it was the vehicle manufacturer versus the supplier in that standpoint. My point being, I think if they would have acted like a Japanese in the terms of the Japanese culture of respecting the design, the engineering, the production capabilities of the suppliers, it would have been a different industry. But they treated them just as bad as any other supplier, even though they were.
Well, John, do you think that goes to the cultural thing of the people who were running the car companies, or in managerial positions, not just running, but I mean, who are in charge of those guys?
I think you got to look at a big picture here. So number one, when they were vertically integrated and they were oligopolies, and they were, GM, Ford, and Chrysler were oligopolies. They had collectively 90% plus of the market. So everybody had to do whatever they wanted them to do, whether it was the customer, the dealers, or the suppliers. And so when things started to change, when international competition, namely the Japanese, started to come in and eat their market share, they really got much more focused on cost, because now they had to compete with the Japanese. They couldn't just pass cost along. And so when they started looking at highly labor-intensive operations, like wiring harnesses and cut and sew for making seat covers and seat assembly, it was like, holy crap, we can outsource this to suppliers who are paying 50% less on their labor costs. Also, those suppliers, they can ship to any automaker. They're not just an in-house one. And that was part of the culture thing, I think, that you got to. The supplier, the in-house supplier operations knew the company had to buy from them. There was no competition there. And when you started to get into new technologies, then the automakers started to realize, wow, now we got to spend a lot of capital on our in-house operations. Why don't we just start outsourcing this stuff? And so the outsourcing craze started in the early 80s. And then they took it too far. They outsourced too much, and they realized, and they pulled some back. And there's still this ongoing debate today. Is it make or buy? Do we make it ourselves, or do we buy it from a supplier?
So Dave, you mentioned Visteon and Delphi. That didn't work out so well for either of those two companies going forward.
In the end, yeah.
No, it didn't. And I was out of the analyst role after they really were established through their IPOs and were standalone companies from that standpoint. And that was probably because they were staffed managerially with people who still had the mindset of their parent, right? They weren't the true competitor. and also the piece of competition changed, I think, from exterior design and a bit on interior design, really heavy to technology. But look, I think when I went through the Visteon R&D centers and all those things, and you look at some of the instrument cluster, the instrument clusters and all, a lot of that innovation started at Visteon or with Visteon. So it wasn't like they didn't have it or couldn't do it, but I just don't know why they didn't get the establishment and to go up against the other independent, always an independent.
But remember, Dave, they were unionized.
Mhm.
And so you don't only have much higher labor rates, you've got union work rules, lines of demarcation, threats of strikes. You have to create a much bigger labor staff. And so I think that played a key role in why they were not able to compete. Having said that, several of the spinoffs have done fantastic. Detroit Diesel, which is now part of Daimler Truck, is healthy and going. American Axle has done relatively well for itself. Delco Remy, is still alive and kicking. So there were operations that were spun off that, figured out. Now, having said that, look who their leaders were. Roger Penske as the head of Detroit Diesel. Dick Dowk is the head of American Axle. Hal Sperlich, former president of Chrysler, running Delco Remy.
They were dynamic personalities.
Dynamic executives. So even though they may have had that OEM mindset, they got it. They knew exactly what they had to do. Roger didn't have that OEM mindset. He's always been an entrepreneur.
And they had the operations standpoint and more of an engineering bent, I think, for the cost piece of the puzzle. Yeah, on the union side, I've always have felt that it was as much, if not more, the work rules
Yes.
that stymied the flexibility that then you couldn't overcome the cost differential.
It's not so much the wages and
yeah,
benefits.
right.
You can manage
Yeah.
that.
If you had the flexibility.
But having to
do
manage a
that.
plant along with a union adds a huge layer of complexity.
So Dave, I want to ask you about your findings for this 25th Working Relations Index, because I think that there are some surprises to me anyway in here. Now, what's not surprising is that Toyota leads the pack again, okay? But what is surprising is the space between them and the one at the bottom, Stellantis. So on a 500-point scale, which I think is absurd because nobody's ever to get near 500 because the top has only been 415 by Toyota back in the day. Okay, so Toyota scores 386, Stellantis scores 141. How can Stellantis compete when its suppliers have such a low level of respect for the company?
Well, and we've seen that you have to take at least a 3-year window on that, because if you go, no, and here, this is where I'm going, Gary, is if you go back and when Stellantis was riding high on, well, don't look at the WRI numbers. No, riding high on the Ram pickup truck sales, on the Cherokee, on the Grand Cherokee, and they were making higher margins than the other two big three. Their profitability was, but their supplier numbers were down here. If you take that snapshot, and maybe if your question going forward, how can they do it? They can't. They need their supply base to be with them, because as John was pointing out, 60-70% of the value of the vehicle is with those suppliers. And so Stellantis is providing the design and the integration and all those other elements, but they need their suppliers. And that's one where the suppliers are starting to make choices of where they're lining up their constrained resources, both human resources and financial resources.
So is it a case that a supplier is more likely to provide an OEM that they have good relationships with the latest technology versus others that don't score quite so high in terms of the relationship index?
Absolutely. And that plays out in many different forms. It does come back to the cost to serve, which has been a big theme for us this year in the WRI rollout. So think of it from this standpoint. You have a history of getting paid for that innovation, for the volumes on that innovation. Is it going to be exclusivity, or can you sell it to all of those other elements? So when the tech fairs happen and the other types of innovation fairs happen, without a doubt, the innovation gets shown to your better customers. But equally important is every day-to-day operation. So there's a problem in the assembly plant on a potential warranty issue, and they call. Is the supplier, and particularly if they get 2 or 3 calls, is the supplier going to send out the team to the assembly plant of their best engineers, their best workaround experts, to the customer they have the most difficult relationship with, or the one with the best? And that may not be just the pure profitability piece. It's just all the friction that goes into the relationship. And the suppliers will say that while contractually they have to provide production to all of their customers, it doesn't mean that you can't respond quicker or better to an issue with the people you have a better working relationship with. That's what this shows. And I think back to your point about how wide the range is this year really points to how difficult it is to be a supplier today, because typically the suppliers supply at least 4, or even sometimes 5 or 6 of those OEMs. So you have to have your own system set up to fit what a Stellantis, how to work with a Stellantis, as well as how to work with a Toyota. And that's a tremendous amount of complexity.
Dave, what's your sense in looking at the supply base you interviewed? Any differences of feeling towards the OEM comparing, say, hard parts suppliers and software and electronic suppliers, which the latter being a major cause of customer dissatisfaction today?
Yeah, so that's one area where, as John mentioned, I'm going to be retiring at the end of this month. Angela Johnson will be taking over for me, and we're working with a group of suppliers right now to change around the questionnaire, because it was developed for the hard parts, stamping, forging, casting, and volume. Yeah, high production parts too. So we're going to integrate more things like over-the-air updates. How does that happen? Progress payments for tooling, for hard tooling, is completely different than progress payments for software.
Sure. Yeah.
So John, from what he was saying about the situation, say with Stellantis, and we were talking earlier before the show started about the Ram EV pickup truck, and you were suggesting that it may not come out. I wonder how much of that might be predicated on technology issues with the supply base.
I'm speculating that Ram will not, and it's speculation, will not come out with its BEV pickup. Why? Because BEV pickups are not selling very well. I mean, the Ford Ranger, or the Ford Lightning, is now outselling the Cybertruck. The Silverado is less than that. The Rivian's less than that. The GMC Sierra is less than that. None of them, if you look at their sales through the first 5 months, none of them will crack 30,000 sales this year.
Yeah.
You can't make money at that. So why would you bring a new truck to the market knowing it's dead on arrival? You're just going to lose money on it. I think Stellantis has got a lot of issues to solve right now. Why would you bring a product to market that you know you're going to lose money on? I think it's better bite the bullet, write off the investment in that, go to the EREV, the extended range EV version of that truck, which I think happens to have a much better fighting chance than a pure BEV does, because you can tow with it, you can haul heavy loads and the like. I don't think it's a technology issue, except as technology is such with EVs right now that they're really not conducive to towing or hauling heavy loads.
Yeah, the use cases aren't there.
And
But flip around everything you just said about Stellantis in terms of the volume, the profitability, all those things. It's the same for the suppliers, right?
Right.
Because,
in fact,
so why would the supplier go and put in a lot of investment, certainly in new innovation that's bespoke to one vehicle manufacturer and certainly to one nameplate or one platform? Let me go there. If they don't believe there's going to be a return on that investment.
So, okay, but if I'm a supplier, I mean, my existence is predicated on my being able to sell stuff to someone else. Wouldn't I just be interested in trying to sell to whomever I possibly can to keep my business going?
But as long as you know you can sell, whether it's fitment, specifications, all of those other elements to those other customers, yeah. Because if it's to a Stellantis design, then I'm locked in. And that's where it's interesting watching or reading the analysts and everything now of you still have to keep a EV investment stream going because that's where the industry ultimately will be.
Mhm.
We just don't know when. Like all the $4 billion of GM investment that they just announced, some new, some old, but it's $4 billion.
Don't you think though they threw everything in the kitchen sink to make that number look as big as possible?
Well, there's a bit of public relations there, sure.
But
that's maybe going also back to how things have changed. It's back 30 years ago, the industry government relationship was all about regulation, or 90% about regulation. And now it's about the business conditions, it's about trade and tariffs, it's about all the elements of the business case, not necessarily about the product itself, although the tariffs are on the product, but it's about the business versus about hard regulations.
what sense did you get from the study on how suppliers feel about the newcomers? Tesla, I mean, do you have data on that? And even the BYDs. I mean, I've heard just a lot of guys saying, we can't sell it to, the Detroit 3, we've got business growing in China.
Yeah.
And are those companies, Dave, are they learning from all the data year to year from the study, what it takes?
So the other vehicle manufacturers outside the study, we continually talk with, trying to get them into the study. My step is even for the supply base, an intermediate step is saying, let's do a proprietary study. You don't have to be in the public one first. So that's another one that's queued up for after Dave leaves.
Yeah.
No, from this standpoint, we've surveyed, we've gotten data, but the thing is, I was never comfortable that we got a sizable sample across all of the different systems to be able to say that this is representative. Without a doubt, I mean, people have argued, if a number goes up or a number goes down, or maybe what the absolute number, but nobody's ever argued that our ranking is off. That Toyota, Honda, General Motors, Nissan, Ford, and Stellantis, they don't argue the ranking. So we just have to get the right sample to be able to do that.
Do you think those companies will want to come into it? What sense do you have?
No, not yet, because the supplier, well, it's interesting. I mean, John, going back to your portrayal of how some of the arrogance might be of those, like with Tesla.
No arrogance there.
No, but for they own that market.
Yeah.
Right. And so they could put their specs out, they could change, they could go back and forth until, job one, all of those other costs that, the supply, and they did that because they were Tesla. Now that their market share is starting to go down, they have more competition across different segments, all of those types of things with their product portfolio. Time will come when they will care.
Interesting.
Not necessarily right now.
Yeah. So, getting back to this ranking, I mean, it's been fairly consistent, but Ford has been taking a tumble over the last few years.
Yeah.
Why do you think that's the case? Or why? What did your data show you?
Yeah. So I think it's a combination of a couple of things. One is, well, actually, they all point back to one thing: organization. And I point it back to organization two ways, though. First is when they split up, I think, for the Model E and the Ford Blue piece, that confused internally, engineering, purchasing, all those types of things. It confused the external with the suppliers too. Who is making decisions and things like that we see with the Japanese companies about, is it North America or Japan making decisions? We saw that just within Dearborn. The other element that they structurally over the last couple of years have done is to move a lot of purchasing activity, both first to Mexico and then it was to India that they moved centers to. And in a time when the industry has a lot of uncertainty, a lot of, just leave it at that, the last thing you want to do is extend decision-making authority, to extend the timeliness of decisions. And that's what they've done. I mean, even from like looking at tooling payment disputes, that a decision has to go over to the Indian group, take a look. Information may or may not be there, to be missing, has to come back, has to go back over. And you're looking at talking about cost pressures, and you're delaying the payment to a supplier. Well, that's going to impact your numbers dramatically, because your cost to serve is going up. It's a reverse relationship to your WRI number.
So, okay, I'm a supplier and I'm based in Allen Park, which is right next door to Dearborn.
Right across I-94.
I've got a problem.
Yeah.
I've got to deal with India rather than the guy who's like literally across the street.
Depending upon what it is, yeah. And let me just say this, that it's also difficult when the Ford organization itself doesn't know the process too. So if a supplier needs an answer and they can't get a quick answer, that's, again, it's an inverse relationship. So So that those would be the two things. And so I point it directly back to the organization.
Hey, we saw some news break in China this week where there's been a move to essentially compel the automakers to pay their suppliers within 60 days. And, you know, this has been a complaint here in the US. I know it's been in Europe too, that when times get bad, when money gets tight, automakers start stretching out the time it takes to pay. You know, the horror cases have been 90 days. Well, in China, it was way worse than that. It was 140 days. It was 160 days. It was 180 days. I think BYD was over 200 days in paying. And the government, through different ministries now, is starting to crack. The government's starting to get worried about the Chinese auto. The Chinese government is getting worried about the Chinese auto industry. And, you know, we're seeing none of them are making money. Maybe 3 automakers are making money there. Dealers are going out of business by the thousands. And so 3 different ministries sort of, it looked like, cajoled these automakers into saying, you've got to pay within 60 days. And literally just yesterday, almost every Chinese automaker came out and said, we've got a new policy now. We're going to pay within 60 days. Where do we stand in this country now? And what do you think of the move in China?
Well, there and before that, the Japanese government made the same request out of their top vehicle manufacturers as well, because they were worried about how fragile the supply base was. And some of those decisions there ended up coming over here, because that's the thing, going back to, you want to try to be one Toyota or one Ford, you know, back in the Malali days. And so that transfers over here. Payments have pretty well stayed the same over the last, I want to say, 3 years, 4 years type of piece there. It was interesting with one of the vehicle manufacturers. It was last year when I was reporting out to them, I made a statement saying, look, one way you could improve your numbers, I know it's costly, but is to shorten your payment terms. And that wasn't a popular thing to say in the purchasing staff meeting, because what they came back, well, who's saying, you know, how big of an issue is that? All those other kinds of things. And my point was, wait a minute, we know you have all the financial numbers on your supply base. You know how fragile it is. So the last thing you want to do is extend those payment terms. That's the type of thing, going back to what we see in the survey and thing, is where, not, I guess this is going to sound like I'm picking on finance, but if finance says, no, wait a minute, we need a little more cash on our balance sheet and not on the supplier's balance sheet, so we're going to extend it. That's where I think the survey has served a good purpose over the years. Then purchasing can go to finance and say, look, this is what you're causing us. And it goes back to innovation, slowing down. It goes back to, and they know the stories about the customer support and things like that.
You know, speaking of gripes, a neighbor who works at a tier 1 said to me this morning, asked Dave Andrea about an ongoing, he called it a generational issue, and that's late engineering changes. And I remember doing reporting on this years ago, you know, and talking to people, and they're no longer, we're freezing it, we're not budging, and we still hear this from the supply base. What is your data showing?
Yeah, so we do ask about, actually in 3 different ways, are late or excessive engineering changes impacting cost, timing, and quality. And if you look at Toyota's over the last couple of years, some of their numbers have worsened on that. And you think, well, but then you look at the situation of like when they were putting out the new Toyota architecture, generation architecture on the new Camry and those types of things, their late engineering changes spike up because most of that, if not all of that, was being done in Japan. So it's an issue. That's the one thing I keep saying to the OEM, use this data to try to convince product development and marketing. Now I am picking on those two functions to simplify your product mix. We've heard over and over again from many of the OEMs, the old 80-20 rule, 80% of our sales comes from 20% of our part numbers, our SKUs, however you want to define it. But we don't reduce that complexity. And by not reducing that complexity, we still have all the engineering changes that go along with that.
But there's a new dynamic in the industry now too, that Tesla started and the Chinese are copying, and that's engineering changes on the fly. And part of it is to get to market faster, not wait until you have 100% development, launch the product, and with over-the-air updates and other improvements along the line, catch up, so to speak. Also, getting to market faster. It's very obvious in the industry, firstest with the mostest is going to gain market share. And,
But not if it's the worstest.
not if it's the worstest. No, that's absolutely true.
Or does it catch up with you?
But,
in terms of warranty and other kinds of costs. But
Right.
keep going. I understand.
But no, you're right.
Yeah.
So, the Silicon Valley model is essentially what Tesla adopted. And now the Chinese startups, maybe not necessarily the state-owned enterprises in China, but it's, break things fast, iterate. Don't wait until everything's perfect. Get it 80% of the way there and go with a launch. And, Alex Partners even came out with a study on this is, the Western companies, and I'll throw the Japanese and the Koreans into that, want to have the absolute last piece of NVH, of ride and handling, acceleration and braking, absolutely perfect before they launch a car.
Yeah.
And so they hit the market at a later date with higher cost and are losing market share. So how do you reconcile with what you're saying there with this new imperative to go fast and break things?
So I'm going to reconcile it by saying what's your go fast and break things that are absolutely rooted in safety validation, on engineering validation, and all those things. And then what are the excessive engineering changes based on we're trying to get that last feel for the vehicle dynamics or types of things. And that was one where I go back to more things change, the more they sing. How Taitang from Ford was on that at least 7 years ago, and we haven't gotten there. Because the engineer wanted to get it perfect, which is an engineering mindset without a doubt. And what would the customer pay for? So that's where I would separate out kind of the hardcore vehicle functionality versus coming up with the last 5% of to get it perfect in the vehicle dynamic.
Right. The other thing we're seeing the Chinese
feel.
doing is buying a lot of off-the-shelf parts. They're there, they're engineered, they're validated, they're Six Sigma, they're ready to go. Why reinvent the wheel?
Yeah, which is huge because the supply base can provide that without a doubt. But this comes back to some of the vehicle manufacturers having to have their own design, having to have their own engineering, or it's not right. And
How do you break that mindset? Yeah,
Well-
so I'll give you a
well-
couple of examples.
well,
Tire pressure monitor systems.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
a little
there-
thing that tells you
Yep,
what the pressure
yep.
is. Every car company's got a different one.
Yeah, yeah.
Why? You know, windshield wiper actuators. It's under the, you know, the cowl. Nobody ever sees it. As
Yeah.
long as it works. But they all have different
Yeah.
ones. Why? The filler neck where you stick the nozzle in to fill your tank up. They're all different.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, going back to an old story, I was at a dinner at the Henry Ford Museum, and I was, you start conversation with the guy next to you, and I said, what do you do? And he said, oh, I design tie rods. And I said, oh, really? And he gave me that was for a hybrid vehicle and I mean, I'm going back 15 years, so you kind of probably guess who the hybrid was. And I said, oh, I'm not an engineer, but is that because different weights that you have to have a different tie rod end than the base one, the internal combustion engine and not the hybrid? Or what? And he said, no, it has nothing to do about functionality. We got the budget to do it, so we're going to do it. And that's a chief engineer, problem. So I didn't solve that problem for you, but I explained maybe why it's there. When your point about, okay, so when does it end? Well, a good bankruptcy or two will do that. That will end it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of collateral damage that comes along with that. But sometimes, unfortunately, you have to hit that proverbial wall.
What you're saying, Dave, in a way, is they have too many resources. You know, because when you have limited resources, you think your way through the problems. You don't buy your way out of the problem.
Yeah, well, and wasn't that kind of the American Motors, Chrysler?
Absolutely
motif?
right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know,
Yeah.
American Motors had limited resources.
Yeah.
They did brilliantly with the
Yeah.
resources they had. Chrysler, coming out of the first bankruptcy, based everything on the K car. And it did actually rather well. They really came out with some innovative product off a common platform.
But doesn't
Yeah.
every company think they have limited resources?
Well, every person, I was going to try to flip it around, Gary, something clever. Every individual, yes, within those organizations, and so then collectively, there's never enough, right? And that's, yeah, if that's an American thing.
No, it's not.
Curious. Okay.
You know, because I don't mean to pick on Mercedes and BMW, but they have, you want to reduce complexity?
Oh my God.
Boy, they have a complexity
Yeah,
issue
yeah,
to
yeah.
start. They have way too many models, too many variants of those models.
Well,
And,
BMW, yeah. How do you separate all those nameplates? I don't-
Exactly. And they recognize that they have too much,
Yeah.
but they can't seem to stop themselves.
So Dave, I want to go back to, as an example,
Okay.
we were talking earlier about the General Motors, $4 billion for the 3 factories, Orion, Fairfax, and Spring Hill.
Yeah.
And this is in the context of suppliers. So Orion was going to become a plant where they're going to be building full-size EVs, right? And now they're basically going, we should put ICE products in there because people are buying ICE products, okay? But you're a supplier and you've been talking to them and you've been having your people work on projects that would serve this full-size EV SUV, which is now not applicable at all to what they're going to be. So over the last few years, haven't suppliers been faced with having to do this and this and still be able to make money?
Doing it. Yeah. And that's where I've tried to convey that profitability is not the piece, that you look at each individual program and say, keep going with GM. Is it a profitable business for you? Because it's not just on each of those piece prices. It's about, I've invested tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of capacity or in tooling that's sitting idle. And so if I look at my GM business, now all of a sudden my rate of return goes down dramatically on my current business, and I have to try to figure out how to get it back on my future business. And that's one where I think with the shifts in product plans and product cadence and all those types of things, it's not a purchasing alone decision. It's got to be with your manufacturing. It's got to be with your engineering and finance to say, and maybe it's easy for me to say, bite the bullet. And maybe there's a special payment schedule that you do to help the supplier cover their empty capacity that they have. Maybe and this is not the old, we make it up on volume, right? We're losing on this product, but we make it up on that. And it really gets down to realistic production volume estimates. John, going back to what you were going through on the EV pickup trucks. We've been through it so many times before that I think any of the vehicle manufacturers can really take a step out and show they're different if they stabilize and that's where Toyota and Honda were golden for all those years, because the old proverbial piece where you designed the production for one less than you thought you were going to sell, and you might give up some volume, you might give up some sales, but I think that's the mindset you have to get into to put your competition out of business, because you get the right supply base, A, and then B, you can price your product more competitively because you're not carrying that burden around, even though you may be selling fewer vehicles. And the industry has talked about that for all, we're going about margins, we're not going about volume, but it's an easy trap to fall back into, to try to get the volume.
Which goes back to the beginning of it was talked about then, it's talked about now.
Yeah. And so the industry, I think, without a doubt, I got into it because I love the designs, I love the engine, even for the business economist and corporate finance guy, I love the product. And there's still a love for that product. I don't know. So it's still there. It can still be there. It's going to be a different cast of characters, both on the vehicle manufacturer side and I think on the supplier side. And some of that also, Lindsay, goes back to your question about the software providers and some of those, and that, the soft side versus the hard part side is going to change dramatically.
Well, in that realm too, recently we've seen two German suppliers that were heading from the traditional industry, transmissions with ZF and tires with Conti, into tech companies. They were tech companies, just exploding with self-driving technology, interior technology, radars, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're splitting off and kind of heading back into, it's like Johnson Controls makes thermostats now. They're all kind of reverting to that
Yeah, to
You
their
know,
roots
right.
and focus.
And
that's
then
no
today we
different.
saw, or yesterday we
Yeah.
saw Morelli,
Mhm.
filing Chapter 11. So what happens in that scenario where we had these giants that were really kind of scooping up smaller companies and really leading in technology, and now with this uncertainty over EVs and uncertainty over AVs, what happens to those who wanted to play in that realm?
Yeah. It's no different than the vehicle manufacturers, right? Who grew, and what you described, rather than a lot more vertical integration, that was much more on the horizontal side, that they wanted to be in all those mobility pieces.
Right.
And that's one where I've seen the industry go back and forth, these pendulum swings where we have to have massive change to have something to talk about, one. But the Toyota case of incremental improvement, right? Kind of the Kaizen, it's boring, but boy, do you make a lot more money over the course of the year, rather than acquiring and then splitting up, and then acquiring and then splitting up again. So I think we'll end up with a supply base that it requires greater ability to partner, and versus ownership. And I think that's and even with the vehicle manufacturers, I think that's where we go. There's these little rumblings out there about powertrain partnerships and things like that. Gary, as you smile, like he's yeah, that'll be the day that I see that. But
It's John's favorite subject.
No, but we get to it. Eventually the economics will force it, because you can't. And going back 20 years, the studies on the industry, we've destroyed more capital than we've created. If you do the pure math, I'm not saying if you look at, what we've built around and what our communities are built on and all those things. I think if you take that into account, we've created more capital. But if you just take a pure basis, that's Stearns and Stewart, if I remember right from my U of M days, math, yeah, we're negative. And Sergio Marchione, right, pointed that out in his capitalist confessions of a capitalist, right?
Capital junkie.
Yeah.
Right. No, I completely agree with you. Finance is going to force the industry to do things differently. It's already started. And you're seeing suppliers merging, not of their own volition. It's usually venture capitalists buying up distressed companies and forcing the merger. You're hearing more and more car companies talking about the need to partner with another car company. And by and large, that hasn't worked. And so that's why I think they're a little bit gun shy about it. But, the days of easy capital are over. The SPAC thing ran its course. Interest rates are high. The investment community has seen that all this autonomy and electric vehicle stuff is not going to happen in this decade, and they're taking their money elsewhere. The industry is going to have to figure out how to get things done on a much more capital efficient basis.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch what Toyota's been doing on the product side, on their truck portfolio, and then also bringing in from their Keiretsu, right, to vertically integrate to see. It's an interesting study to see how do they manage those assets that way. I guess if you'll allow me to put my SAE hat on. See, I think that's where standards come into play. Back to your off the shelf, whether that's about off the shelf parts, or if it's talking about partnerships and things like that, that we we can standardize. We got the standards for the part and for the software and for the validation processes and all those things. We have to get more standards about the business operations of how those partnerships work. And then we can put the powertrain folks together.
Is that difficult to do though?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then that's why it hasn't been done.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess, John, as you're saying, that there's not the capital markets anymore to feed this beast. So that's no different than what we were talking about over here with the suppliers. There's not enough of them to go around to feed the beast. So they're going to be selective too. And that forces you to focus on maybe those top three in the survey, and maybe the other vehicle manufacturers start looking at what do they have that we need to put in place to be a customer of choice too.
You guys have been doing this for
For
so many
20
years.
years,
I mean,
yeah.
it's just like
Yeah.
they
I
don't
know.
know by now.
I know.
Yeah.
And I did want, just a little sarcastically, I did want, all those OEMs to be in that, at least in the average group, right? Before I left, but didn't get there, did I?
Well, look, we're going to have to wrap this up, but Dave, I think you hit the theme perfect for the discussion that we've had here today. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the thing that always frustrates me is if you talk to individuals, they know. They, like, even within the vehicle manufacturers, the executives, they know those issues. And here, look, I mean, the one that I think kind of shook Nissan up several years back was when they hit the bottom, and we went in with the comments, and there was 3 or 4, it wasn't overwhelming, but that said, I know my buyer knew what the right thing to do was, but wouldn't do it because the organization wouldn't support it. And that's not an individual. It's not that they weren't competent, that they, it's because of leadership. It's because the organization systems, that there are probably good people and bad systems.
Yeah.
To be fair to Nissan, before we go though, they weren't at the bottom. General Motors was the bottom of the bottom.
Well, yeah. If
And-
you go, yes.
So they hit the all-time low back in 2010,
Yeah.
and now they have gone way, way, way up.
Yeah, because it shook them up. Well, and then plus Nissan was number 3, right? Number 4, not going back all that many years. So it's possible. And then Gone came in, and the proverbial train went off of the tracks, didn't it?
I found it funny that when Ford was doing its best within the last 10 years, Hackett was in charge.
Of course, those might have been a result of policies that Mullally put in place. So who knows? But like I said, we're going to have to wrap it up.
Good.
Dave, Andrea, thanks so much for coming on. You'll have to
Absolutely.
let us know what the next chapter of your career might be.
I'll still be around town.
Good.
John.
Yeah.
Lindsay, Brooke, great having you here
Thanks,
too.
John.
Yeah.
Good to be here.
And Gary, we'll keep on doing it.
Yep.
And
Very
thanks to all of you for having watched, and please excuse the technical difficulties we had with today's show.